Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My line of question will be for Mr. Shedd. Of course, one of the reasons that we know the American economic system is superior to that of China is that, by and large, the priorities and the market conduct of our companies are determined by managers and owners as opposed to government officials. Now, of course, that being said, I do understand the real value that come from properly constructed export controls and other IP protections. But I want to chat with you a little bit about how do we strike that right balance? How do we get the Goldilocks spot? I think a number of members of the committee have been properly captivated by your crown jewels doctrine. How do we ensure that we don't overstep with the regulations around American company behavior? And are there some things that we should endeavor to not do as we attempt to make sure that companies in America, that their interests are well aligned with our national security interests?
Thank you very much for your question, Congressman. I am struck by someone who grew up for a period of time in Chile under communism, 1970 to late 1972. And I can tell you it wasn't—
I'm sorry, perhaps the gentleman could pull the microphone just a little closer. Thank you.
Is that better? And having grown up in Latin America and in Chile during that period of time, it's not a world that I want to live under, and having state control of the private sector. So to your premise, how do we find that sweet spot, that Goldilocks perfect state? I'd give you three ideas. The first is encouraging corporate America, and I don't mean legislatively, but certainly as my colleague to the left has talked about, better educating with what the federal government knows the Chinese are doing to corporate America, to be able to have them protect those crown jewels, as I refer to them, in what I call a small yard with high fences. That is, the cyber protections around that. That may not be 80, 90% of the rest of the company, but where that IP is that they do not want to lose, that needs to be very clearly defined. Secondly, I would look at the area of investments by China in the United States and the front companies that they set up in terms of whether it's venture capital or into private equity, and where they own a piece of the company that they're a part of. And again, I would encourage that my former colleagues of the Federal Bureau of Investigation have those kind of discussions at a higher level. And finally, and again, it's not a legislative action, and I have spoken to a number of the Fortune 500 chief security officers as a result of this book, that security be elevated into the C-suite, if I can put it that way. In other words, treating it as it should be in terms of the threat that it represents. But I am not here to argue that we are better off if the federal government introduces more legislation, more regulatory demands on most of corporate America, but rather that it be an education process in which they're able then to take the actions themselves, motivated, by the way, by quarter-on-quarter profits that are affected by the stealing of their intellectual property.
So, yes, I think the way you laid that out provides me more confidence when you talk about educating and encouraging companies to do the right thing. I think that makes sense. You know, in your testimony, you talked about requiring companies to treat their R&D and intellectual property as national security infrastructure. Give me an example of what form does that requirement take?
So, coming out of an intelligence and defense background, I look at the listing of which you have a known affiliation by the Chinese, whether it's intelligence, security, or PLA in terms of its support, which is virtually indistinguishable, that has a relationship with Department of War contracts. There you need to call that out. That is regulatory. And so you would be identifying that list of those companies that have that association. And frankly, when that's identified, if there is a merging of contract money that the taxpayers, the U.S. taxpayers, putting into it, with known Chinese association on the other side, that's the regulated part. That's one example.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.